Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Page Turners Plus. The last time you saw us, we were reflecting on Casualties of Truth by Lauren Francis-Sharma. This time, we have Lauren Francis-Sharma once more to have a conversation with her. Welcome, Lauren.
Thank you. Hi.
It is our pleasure. So, I suppose I could start with trauma in this novel. You address trauma in your two other novels, but in this one, it felt more intense. Did it feel that way to you?
Yeah, it certainly did. It's funny. I don't think until I wrote this novel that I thought that I addressed trauma a lot, but I shocked myself with this one. Yeah, I knew the topic was a heavy, heavy topic. It's one of the reasons that I chose sort of the structure, which is slightly more suspenseful than my other two books.
Hi, Lauren. Just really quickly, I thoroughly enjoyed this novel,
Thanks.
and I I have a lot of questions. I'm not sure if we could get through them in 48 minutes, but so on your webpage, you state that the novel was inspired by your time in South Africa, witnessing the Truth and Reconciliation Amnesty hearings. Were there any standout moments for you personally that stayed with you or emerged in your memory from time to time?
Yeah, I was there in 1996, and I was an intern at a law firm, much like my character, and had the opportunity to sit in a week's long testimony that was being held in Johannesburg at the time. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission hearings had sort of moved from province to province in South Africa. So the entire country would have an opportunity to attend if they wanted to. And the testimony that I witnessed were a number of former security officials who were testifying to several different crimes. But the one that stood out the most, the one that I came home with, was the one about 8 boys who had been kidnapped. And these boys, they were tricked by a black double agent who came to their village and essentially told them that he would take them to go train as an ANC activist, and they would learn to shoot guns and fight for the resistance movement. And the boys ended up being murdered on that trip, and their parents didn't know what had happened to them until the day of the hearings, until those men were testifying about what they had done to the boys. And I remember sitting there watching their mothers and their family members hear for the first time what had happened to their children after not knowing. And I don't know, there wasn't a dry eye in the place. It was so impactful. And I remember thinking to myself, oh my God, I didn't know apartheid was like this. Like, I think that I went as a very naive, 20 something year old thinking that it was sort of separation of races. I just didn't have a full concept of how brutal and how horrific those 50 years of apartheid had been in South Africa. So when I came home, I remember telling people, like, oh, you have no idea what happened during this time. Like, and nobody seemed particularly interested. Um, Mandela had won. The country was now black run. It just felt like something that was in the past. So I spent a lot of years just thinking about that time at the hearings. And it wasn't until we were locked down in COVID that I began to really seriously think about writing this story and how could I write this story? Like, how would I do it in such a way that people wouldn't put the book down because it was such heavy material?
I actually wanted to sort of follow up along those lines because, Page Turners Plus, we focus on Caribbean literature. And we did your previous book, The Book of the Little Axe. And this is very interesting because it's a book by a Caribbean author, but it's a book about South Africa and the US. And you do get glimpses of Trinidad throughout the novel. And I was wondering whether in your writing process you saw it as a confluence of the lasting impacts of colonialism, where you can make comparisons between the experience in South Africa, the US, the Caribbean. So I was wondering whether that factored into your writing experience as well.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think that it would have been very easy for me to write this character as a Black American without Caribbean roots, right? And just to have her parents be regular old Black American people. But I thought it was very important to layer in um, this background for her. She's American, but she has Caribbean parents, Trinidadian parents. So you get a glimpse of sort of, her father and her mother and sort of the background that she comes from. And a few moments in Trinidad, as you mentioned. It's not a very big book. I probably could have added a lot more if I felt like I wanted to make it another 400-page novel. But I think it was really important, as as a young woman for myself, but also as my character Prudence, understanding sort of global politics, understanding colonialism in the way that she arrives in South Africa and experiences it as a Black American woman, but also sort of bring in this understanding of colonialism, from a Caribbean perspective, from an American perspective, and also now seeing it in South Africa. It was hard not to draw the comparisons, and hard, I think, not to show sort of this link, between all of these places where Black people ended up in the essentially in the slave trade between sort of Africa, not South Africa in particular, but in Africa, in the Caribbean, and in the Americas. So.
So let's talk a little bit about the characters: Prudence, David, Matt, and the I referred to it earlier as the dinner party from hell. Um, I I admire the way you structured the exchanges, and so that the tension, there's recognition of the tension between Matt and Prudence. It was palpable, but not so much Davis and Tara. So the audience, the readers recognize this tension, but Davis and Tara were a bit oblivious, especially the verbal and nonverbal exchanges where Matt says, "You look like a hunter." So I just wanted to hear from you. Was this a scenario that you mapped out in its entirety beforehand, or did it sort of develop organically?
Wow. Yeah, that's a good question. I think that I knew that he had to Matt. This is, he was gonna sort of surprise her, in some way. So he has to show back up in the scene. And when you're thinking about stories and the most effective stories, very often the stranger comes into town. We see that all the time. It's a traditional fiction writing trope. Stranger shows up, and then things sort of unravel. So I was thinking, okay, because he's going to show up. How does he show up? And so I also knew that they had this secret, that she had this secret. And so the question is when he shows up, how quickly will the secret become known to the reader, but also to the people who are sort of in the scene and in her life. And I very quickly realized that in order for to be true to this particular character and the way that her life sort of unfolds. And as you can see, she has a kind of a struggling upbringing. She, pulls herself up. She goes to school. She makes a really good life career. And marries, a man, also a professional man, and they live a nice life. And so she has to be sort of a compartmentalized person. And I think that the dinner reflects the character, who she is, the compartmentalization that needs to happen. And so I wanted to open the reader to that moment so they could see exactly how far she was willing to go to sort of compartmentalize this part of her life. She does not, at that dinner, she does not want anybody to know that she knows this man and that they have a very serious exchange, or that they've had a very serious exchange, 20 something years earlier. So that if I put those things in it, it automatically ratchets up the tension between these characters. So I didn't know how long it was gonna last, though, Deborah. Like, I'm writing and I'm like, well, let's just keep going. Let's see how much I can do here. So it takes up a good real deal of real estate. But if what I did was I sort of interspersed those first meeting moments with her in South Africa, so that you can kind of get the flavor and the detail of sort of how they know one another. And by the end of dinner, you've got the full scenario. So then we take off. Then you've got a story here, and you know exactly what's about to happen. This man has clearly arrived in her life for a particular purpose. It's not by accident.
And it works. It definitely kept me engaged, and like, life comes up and life interrupts, but I did not want to put the book down. I needed to see what was going to happen next.
Thank you. Thanks. Yeah. I mean, I definitely set out to write this book so that you couldn't and didn't want to put it down. I mean, I knew, because the topic is so challenging, and we're living in challenging times, right? Heavy books can be not as appealing to readers. I wanted to make sure that I was writing it in such a way that you would be sort of taken in from the beginning, and intrigued enough to want to turn the page. Obviously, it doesn't work for everybody, but I hoped it would succeed for most people. Yeah.
If my opinion counts for anything, it definitely succeeded. But yeah, I really, really enjoyed it.
Thank
So
you.
I wanted to shift the focus to uh, Roland, Prudence and Davis's son. So in
Mhm.
your first novel, the protagonist is responsible for caring for neurodivergent twins. In this one, the protagonist has a neurodivergent son, Roland.
Mm.
Is that a particular concern for you?
Huh, that's interesting. I don't know if I thought about that. I think that in all of my books, what I do try to do is to make sure a world of people are sort of represented. All of my books have a cast of characters who are of different races and ages, and abilities, and I try to make my fictional world reflective of sort of my personal life and how I live my life, and that's with a cast of people from various backgrounds with various abilities. And very often, when I think about neurodivergence, I reflect on how we have language for that now, where we didn't have language for that when I was growing up. I think about a boy that I knew in middle school who was so, quote, shy that he didn't speak in school. And when he got to high school, I remember his second year in high school, they had a requirement that you had to give a speech in front of class, and he wouldn't show up to school every day. He stopped going to school, and I remember talking to him and saying, "Hey, why don't you just go and just do the thing, like just get it done instead of skipping school?" And he kept trying to explain to me that he couldn't. And I remember thinking, this is the dumbest thing ever. Like, you're gonna flunk out. And sure enough, he flunked out of high school. And now I realize, he has chronic anxiety. Like, there's language, there are things around all of these people that we grew up with that we didn't really understand them. We just thought they were, quote, weird or different or whatever we called them. But they've been in our spaces and in our lives and in our families, um, you know forever. And so I think that it's really important, for me anyway, to represent this sort of wholeness of life that I see, and that I've seen. So I hadn't actually consciously thought about it, but it doesn't surprise me that it's there. Yeah. I'll say one thing else about that. This Roland comes up a lot in my conversations with readers, and what I'm finding also is that we don't have that many pictures of Black women with neurodivergent children in fiction, and I find that to be interesting and maybe slightly disturbing, because there are certainly Black women who are living with neurodivergent children every day. right? And very often they're struggling because people don't understand what's happening. And as part of a Caribbean community, a Black community, we have certain ways that our children are supposed to behave and are supposed to act a certain way. And they're, their aunties and grandmothers who are sort of like, why is that child not behaving? Why is that child not speaking properly? Why is that child? Da, 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 da. You go on and on and on. And it is, I think, sometimes doubly hard for Black women with neurodivergent children to sort of maneuver in the world in a way that makes their children feel safe and loved and all that, because there's so much additional pressure from our community, because we don't all understand exactly what this is that's been happening.
And to follow up or follow on from this, the question of a Black woman raising a neurodivergent child, I have a question about Prudence as a mother. I got the sense that she was expressing some ambivalence at mothering or motherhood, and in some ways seems she seemed to be uncomfortable in her domestic life. So I wanted to hear from you, some your thoughts on that aspect of her characterization.
That's right. I think that's a good read of that. And that doesn't mean that she doesn't want to be a mother, but I think that the idea of having a child who had so many additional needs, or so many additional needs that forced her to sort of come out of the workplace, in a situation where she worked so hard to sort of accomplish this professional life, yeah, I think makes her uncomfortable, slightly resentful, not of the child, but maybe of that spouse that she has. There's tension between her and Davis for sure. And a lot of that tension, I think, comes from this feeling that like she had to give up something that he didn't have to give up. So I don't know. I think, domestic life for sure. I'm not necessarily sure if it's motherhood, because one of the other things that we see in her is this fierce protectiveness. We also get that, that really, a couple of really beautiful moments they have together where she's able to sort of soften herself and be in the moment with her son. There's that scene where she has to go to the school when her son has this interaction with another child, and you see that side of her that kicks in, that that you will not mess with my child, right? And so there is a very complicated, um, I don't know. I think it's a very complicated thing for her, but ultimately, I think we see somebody who's working through it. I mean, he's a pretty young kid still. He's 7 in this, and I think she's every day she's sort of working through what it means to be the parent of this child, and she reflects upon it many times. I think in the novel, am I good enough? Am I doing this right? Like, do I have what it takes to be this child's mother? She's questioning herself all the time.
And then when we had our reflections on the novel, I said that the sort of parallel of Machadiso and Prudence, where Prudence came across as being more, I don't want to use the word forgivable, but more palatable doesn't even sound better either. But we liked Prudence, but I liked Prudence more. And I think part of the reason for that was because you saw that sort of the motherhood coming out, her motherly tendencies. But the novel shows us how Machadiso was severely damaged by his past and doesn't paint him as a sympathetic character. Was that intentional?
Yeah, it was. I think that I'm not sure if everybody sees Prudence as particularly sympathetic either, but um, Deborah's shaking her head. She's like,
But
I don't.
I love her. I love her still. I love her.
Yeah, one of the things that I tried to show was that in the end, they're very similar, these two. And they're both willing to do things that maybe not everybody's willing to do. They're both, both damaged in very similar ways, although, one could say that, that Mashadiso had it much harder, given the sort of life that he led, and all the things that happened to him, and also being adopted, and being put into another, a completely different environment from his childhood. So but I think that they are just two examples of what could happen um, when you have an extremely traumatic event or event series of events where you are sort of growing up in oppressive spaces. Mashadiso obviously different because apartheid was sort of a clearly defined state system, but Prudence grew up in, a city ravaged by crack cocaine at that moment, and she also sort of suffered the small, maybe quieter indignities of being a young Black person during this time. And so, um, two sides of the same coin, I think.
Yeah, and it recalls what we talked about earlier as well. Because I had questions as to why Prudence was drawn to him. And I was saying that I believe it's because there's a part of her that recognized the broken part in her, recognized the broken part in him.
Yeah,
And maybe that is what drew her to him, that caused her to follow him out in the first place, follow him out the courtroom in the first place, and then everything else that happened after.
I think you're spot on, Deborah. That moment in the courtroom where she sees him crying, and she says that too. She says, I don't know why I'm not crying. Like, I know that there's something in me that's being triggered by this moment, but I can't figure out why I'm crying. And there's something that was almost appealing about his tears, like the fact that he could actually cry, had her follow him. Then he ends up being, a real smartass, right? And and you kind of think that, like, though she'll never see him again. But she calls him, and they have this lunch. And the lunch, he shows himself to be, a decent guy, but definitely not someone she's gonna want to spend that much time with. And it isn't until that moment in the gas station, sort of the big moment at the beginning of the book that sort of sets their relationship on a new path, where she calls him and she's in trouble. It's the only person, he's the only person that shows up in this, very harrowing time with her and this police officer. And after he sort of rescues her and they're in the car, and he's so angry for her, right? Like, he's angry for himself, but he's also angry for her, and he's saying to her, you're going to be angrier about this later, you just trust me. And and he begins to sort of follow the police officer. There is a part of her that wants this, and also a part of her that's scared about this side of herself. But the exhilaration she feels when they cut that police officer's tires, like, it's exciting to her. She wanted to pay him back. And so you're absolutely right that there's a part of her that understands um, that part of him, that broken part of him, that need for revenge, that need to get back at something or someone for all the crap that they've had to contend with. And so he's exciting. He's exciting in some ways,
And a bit mysterious as well.
for sure, for sure.
So I actually like literally just picked up on something that you when you mentioned the gas station incident. The other friends that Prudence called never showed up or never called her back, and there's no mention of anything happening after that. So I was wondering whether that was deliberate or I'm just realizing that no one else paid any attention to what happened to her at the gas station.
Yeah,
It
yeah.
was
Well, if
just
you
yeah.
yeah, they didn't call back. And they sort of disappear from the story, if you remember, because at that moment, then the thing happens with the police officer, and then she's trying not to talk about that gas station incident, right? Like, even if they had called, she would have just been like, oh, it was fine, I ended up paying. Like, she wouldn't have told anything. So it seemed almost useless to sort of bring them back up. But in real life, when that very similar situation happened to me, my friends actually came. So
Wow. Though
I
that
know
adds
your face is like, so the I took the worst case scenario of that event and I wrote that event. But the right up until the point where he takes the gun out, is the moment that my friends actually showed up, and he puts the gun away, and they pay for my petrol. And I remember I left South Africa thinking to myself, my God, that could have gone so much worse. So, yeah. And I thought about that. To answer your first question, Deborah, I thought about that for forever. Like, I've never stopped thinking about that gas station.
Well, I'm happy it didn't go to the worst case scenario for
Hmm.
sure. But I also throughout my experience of reading this text, I kept thinking about how it seems to be very concerned with memory and history and truth.
Yeah.
And there was a line that referenced the fact that so many documents were destroyed
Yes.
and that all that was left was memory,
Yes.
and underscoring the importance of people giving bearing witness to their experiences, not just as oppressors or perpetrators, but the people who were on the receiving end
Yes.
of those experiences, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So we were talking about earlier, well, I mentioned it earlier as well in the conversation, where even within the space of a truth and reconciliation hearing, there were people who were protected, the protected class, were completely oblivious to the horrors that were done in towards the goal of protecting them or
Hmm.
maintaining the state. There was a
Hmm.
scene, I think it's between page 62 and 63, where when Voltaire, I think, is describing what Zwane did to those boys, that a white, and I'm quoting here, that he pinned them down to inject them with what? And he says poison. A
Yeah.
white man besides Prudence rose from his seat. Did white South Africans not know what was happening all of those years? So it had me thinking, it got me thinking about how effective the book is in illustrating the many ways there are all of these epistemologies running alongside each other.
Yeah.
And if you could like say a little bit more about that, because if there are all of these streams of knowledge and experience running, where how can we get to reconciliation if they seem to be so discrete?
Yeah. Oh gosh. You know what? Your question gives me chills, right? Because the goal of this book was to point people to this horrible thing that had happened, right? I said this earlier. I said when I came back home, people didn't seem to care, and people didn't seem to, they were just sort of like, oh, did you go on safari? And these are people's stories. These were their lives, and nobody knew what was happening in South Africa outside of South Africa. They kept telling us, and they kept telling the world, and the government had such a hold on the media, such a hold on the narrative. And so, as much as we can fault maybe the Truth and Reconciliation for not actually getting, quote, justice the way that we would have liked to have seen justice, because in the end, many people were not prosecuted. What we did get was these stories on record, right? All these people who were victimized over all these years were finally able to tell, my husband disappeared. my grandmother was brutally beat by the SAP. I mean, on and on and on. They were able to sort of share the most horrific parts of apartheid, for their personal stories. There was no way other than these hearings that could have and would have happened. Just absolutely no way. So I'm so grateful that these things are are recorded and hopefully will be forever kept for future generations to understand what took place there. Um, but you know, I I hesitate to say that the protected class, the white South Africans who were in South Africa during those years didn't understand, because I think they were willfully blind. I think that they chose not to see and not to hear. I think if they wanted to, they could have seen everything and known everything. And since I've been on tour, I've had a number of them show up at my events and tell me that they know that the prevailing narrative is that white South Africans did not know, but they know for sure that it was a lie. And so I remember being in the hearings and watching white South Africans hear the details, and perhaps they didn't know the gruesomeness and the horrificness of the details. Maybe that's true, but they for sure knew that this government was doing terrible things in their name, for sure. And as a citizen of the United States right now, you cannot tell me that people don't know what is happening here right now to the people around us, right? Like, I'm living through this very thing. And you cannot tell me 30 years from now, when I hope to God that these people will be put on trial in the same way, you cannot tell me that we did not know. We know.
And I suppose you just answered the next question that I had was, do you
Sorry.
imagine that the US, no, that do you imagine that the US will undergo a TRC of some description in the future? And I suppose you just answered that. And
That
not necessarily what's happening now, but also, you know, Jim Crow, segregation, enslavement.
Well, yeah. No, we will never have a TRC for anything before this moment. I don't think. Like, we'll never have, yeah, Americans are just too insistent on forgetting, the years of slavery, Jim Crow. It's in the past. It doesn't matter now. Um, but I am very much hoping that we will see, if not sooner rather than later, if we ever get our country back, which I'm not convinced we will, by the way. I'm seriously not convinced that we will ever have a democracy as we believed ourselves to be. If it does happen and we're able to roll back some of this, I do believe that there will be hearings. I do believe that people will be held to account, and it surprises me that the people who are sort of the puppets of this administration don't understand that it will not be the people at the highest level who will be punished for this. It will be the people who put people in vans and brutalize them in ways. Just the minions will be punished, as in South Africa as well. I mean, de Klerk went on to be perfectly fine. I mean, you can you can go on and on with, former South African presidents that never were never punished for this. But the people who were held to account were the police officers on the ground, who did the dirty bidding. And with any luck, that'll be the case here too. What I hope will happen is that we will actually prosecute, differently than in the TRC. I hope that.
It's usually the ones following the orders,
Mhm.
right?
That's right.
Um, to bring it back to this question of reconciliation and truth, because I have a bunch of questions. I was wondering if if it can happen without folks acknowledging, well, we kind of went over it, but I'm thinking in terms of Matt, 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 and the burden that he has to carry
Hmm.
and how it affected him in a way that maybe somebody who can claim ignorance, not even acknowledging the truths. How can you say a little bit more about him and how he carries this? I at one point I saw it in the text. It said child shock, and how he carried that throughout, and it seemed to have physiological effects on his body.
Yeah. Um, Yeah, that term wasn't used very much, but in my research, I ended up stumbling upon it as a term that's used for young people who grow up in sort of war circumstances, right? Which 50 years of apartheid was war. Essentially on Black people in South Africa, but you know what was interesting was when I was in South Africa in 1996. I remember and my very good friend who lives there now, she was actually studying here in the United States at the time that I was in South Africa. And I met her father, who I think now he's in his 90s. So he would have, I would say he was probably born in 1930s, or yes, probably 1930s or so. And he was a very tall man, like, very tall man. And Mandela was a very tall man. And you could see a whole generation of Black South African men who were actually like very tall. They had, like, their bodies were lean, and then when I was there, I remember writing her an email and saying, "Why are all the men here so short?" Like, and and I remember her saying to me, "Huh," and we talked about it, and I realized that, like, the years of apartheid, um the lack of resources, the inability for people to sort of buy and buy good foods and proper foods for their family, the shortage of the high unemployment rate for Black people, all of this contributed to what I saw as a physical manifestation of apartheid in the gene pool of Black people. Now, if you go to South Africa right now and you look at anyone who is 20 something years old or so, they've gotten their height back. And it's so kind of fascinating to see this, what I see as a physiological response to real oppression. And so the question for me with Matt was, what does it do to live in this space, right? Like, what does it do to your physical body? What does it do to your emotions, your psychological well-being? Matt is not well. He's not well, right? Prudence is not well. Prudence has been able to sort of mask hers a little better, but Matt is so angry. And he's so angry because he didn't get a voice in how, a man like Volter or a man like Zwane um, got to get up there and be allowed to have, quote, amnesty for telling the truth about what had happened to his family, to his country, to his people. And there were a lot of South Africans who felt that way. Even during the hearings, even though there were people who were testifying to what had happened to them, many of them were saying, "This is not enough for me. Why didn't you come to me before you were applying for amnesty to tell me what had happened to my husband and my children? This is not enough. I want justice." Um, they were sacrificed for the good of the country, to be able to sort of move on. But justice was not given to many people who wanted justice. And I think that is unfortunately the negative part of that legacy, is that there are people who remain and will die angry.
Yeah, and we were speaking earlier about the sacrifices, the idea of sacrifice what is at stake and who gets to move on, who gets to shrug all of the ordeals off and just, okay, you acknowledge it happened, but then you can move on with your life, and you've not really lost anything. But the people who are on the receiving end of this brutal, well, state-sponsored terrorism, I would say,
Mhm.
have this is asymmetrical expectation of forgiveness and grace, and to give forgiveness, to give grace, to just move right along with the affairs of the day.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think there were a lot of South Africans that didn't agree with this way to move forward. I understand, the Mandela's government sitting down and trying to figure out how we move on, and thinking that this could be, the best resolution. One, to get truth out, right? Like to be able to actually get the true stories, to record them, to hold people accountable for what had happened. Absolutely. But there was also, like you said, the word sacrifice. There was a little bit of everything. Everybody was asked to sacrifice for the greater good. How can we as a country move past this as quickly as possible so that we can get on with the things that will help the future generation thrive better? We can't stay in this moment of pain and looking back for forever, right? Like we have to be able to sort of get up, and everybody was sacrificed in that. One would argue even Mandela himself, right? And he was probably the only leader that they could have had that would have been that this would have been allowed to happen because of how much he himself had suffered during this time. And so, I don't know. I remember leaving there thinking to myself, is this enough? And I think this book was written as a question that remains unanswered. Like, is it enough? Was it enough? Did it ask too much of the people of South Africa? I think arguably it asked too much.
And interestingly, I think the script has been flipped because a few days ago, my friend in Scotland told me that there was a news channel in the UK that did an investigative series on genocide in South Africa. So I immediately asked her, I said, "Oh, do you mean like apartheid?" And she said, "No." They're speaking about what has been happening recently, in geopolitics with, and I think she used the term white genocide. And I was like, very
Yeah,
interesting.
very.
So it's really interesting to see how the script has been flipped. But to bring it back to the novel, you quote several freedom fighters before the opening of each chapter of the novel. Why was that important, and why are those quotations important to Casualties of Truth?
Um, yeah, no, I feel like it was a good way to open every chapter to remind us sort of the people who made sacrifices for us, for Black people, but also for all of these various nations who are implicated in this story, to be able to move forward, to have the place where we have them. I mean, at the time I was writing, I wasn't thinking that Trump was going to get elected again, so maybe I'm eating my words. But I feel like, um, what I tried to do was I tried to make sure that each quote sort of matched the chapter. And so, there's Desmond Tutu, there's Mandela, there's Malcolm X, there's, I think, Dr. King. And then the book opens with an Ida B. Wells quote, about shedding light on truth, which is what I hoped to do with this book. So to me, that's the quote that stands out the most, for me as an author.
Okay, just this is your third. Sorry, this is your third novel. Do you have another project that you're working on, and something that you want to talk about a little bit? Drop a hint on.
No. um, yeah, no, I'm working on something. But you know what's funny is that I think the last time I was on this show, I might have mentioned, maybe I mentioned a book, and it wasn't this book. I didn't know this book was going to be my next book. So I might have mentioned the book that I'm still hoping will be my next book. We'll see. I don't know. The whims of the publicity, or sorry, the whims of the publishing business is it confuses me, frankly. It is a constant struggle to be a black writer in American publishing. They're gatekeepers, and not all the stories that we want to tell will necessarily be published. We might have to figure out other ways to do that. I don't know what it looks like, in the next couple years trying to publish under the regime that we're living under. I don't know. I have real concerns. To be honest with you, I mean, selling this book, I got wonderful reviews, so I can't complain about that. But the day to day hustle of getting people to pay attention to books and to reading is just it's a struggle. It is a struggle. People want to be on the phone. People want to be in front of screens, and you're fighting for a very very small percentage of people who still want to hold a book, and there's so many people being published, and there's only but so many people that get publicity for the books that they have. So when I say how appreciative I am of you all having me back, I'm incredibly appreciative. Thank you so much, really.
Thank you very much. We're basically out of time, but this conversation has been emotional, enlightening, riveting,
Thank you.
all the good
Thanks.
descriptive words.
And
Thank you very much.
satisfactory.
Yes.
Satisfactory reading experience for me.
Oh, thank you very much.
Yes.
I appreciate it so much. You all are some of my favorite people to talk to. So thank you.
Oh, that's a huge plus for Page Turner's plus.
Yes.
But for but for our viewers and listeners, the next time you see us, we'll be reflecting on Marcia Douglas's Jamaica collection. Until then, goodbye. Have a lovely day.